Hi everyone, my name is Shawn, and I'm here to talk about hooks. What's really great and convenient is that half the room already knows hooks and uses React, so I don't have to introduce it very much. My name is Shawn. I go by Swyx on Twitter. I work at Netlify as a developer experience engineer. I moonlight as a moderator on the React subreddit. There's 120,000 of us talking about React and getting jobs and getting started in React. If you want to join and hire people, please join us. And my other big thing is that I learn in public. So anything that I learn, I try to do talks and blog posts and share stuff. And this is one of those. So I'm going to start this talk by talking about Rene Magritte. He's one of these painters. You might recognize the painting in the background. That's one of his more famous ones. That's the man in the bowler hat. And he does several variations of this. This one's probably, you've seen this as well. And they're all surrealist. Like they look really good. He has skills, but he just paints something that's not exactly real, and it's meant to make you slightly disturbed, slightly like out of kilter. This one's also, I really like this because it's like kind of just like a floating rock. That's probably the inspiration for Pandora. And this one I also like. It's just kind of like there's like human intimacy, but they're not really seeing each other. You can't see them. He has a thing against painting faces. This one's about, I think, in the impermanence of life, like things remain and the man just goes away. Anyway, the most famous one is probably this one. I'm not good at French, but it just says this is not a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. It's not a pipe. So it's an interesting, useful model for people to discuss. It's meant to make you slightly off kilter, but I think it's actually useful, right? Like you can point to this and everyone knows what you're talking about. It's a pipe. And this is the frame that I want to set this talk with. Like, this is not a pipe, but it is a useful discussion of a pipe. How does that have to, and I'm updated it for the millennials. So this is a little bit more updated in terms of a meme. That meme was like 100 years old. This is a bit more recent, and this is the more recent one. Is this a pipe? I'm very good with memes. So what does that have to do with React hooks? I'm going to assume that everyone's seen the talks and see the video and see the docs. Obviously, go check it out if you haven't. And mainly, hooks are meant to replace some of the problems with classes, and in particular, binding the this. That's not the only issue, and that's not the primary issue, but that is one of the issues. But we happen to have exchanged the problem with that with closures. You start to run into stale closures all the time, and having to refresh your memory on what closures are. So I was running into that as well as I was adopting hooks. And so I started to look for definitions. Obviously, you turn to MDN. A closure is a combination of a function in a lexical environment with a function was declared. Very clear, right? And blah, blah, blah. Like, I look at all these comments, and honestly, the most clear one was actually W3 schools. It said closure makes it possible for a function to have private variables. That's the only time I've ever found W3 schools useful. But thank you anyway. So then I had this exercise of like, why not write hooks from scratch and practice closures as well? Because if I can have private variables, I can have stateful functions. So this is the part where we start live coding. And we have time. Okay, so what do I mean by stateful functions? Let's just have a variable on the global scope. I hope this is big enough for everyone. Variable on the global scope, and I'm going to have a function called add. If I can spell under intense scrutiny and pressure. Foo plus 1, it's going to return foo. And now every time I call it, it's going to increment by 1, right? It's a stateful function in the sense that every time I call it, there's some internal state going on that's being mutated, and you can see the result of that. The problem with this is that the foo variable is on the global scope, so any intermediate script can just mess with it, right? Like I can just say like foo 999, and that screws up my my expectations of what's supposed to happen. If I'm writing a library, that's not a good. That's not very secure. So I need to protect this variable somehow and move it off the global scope. And how do I do that? I move that inside the scope of the function, right? And so now JavaScript just refuses to run. It just doesn't let you modify foo. That's great. But I give up the statefulness. I just call it every single time, and it just has the same value. So how do I fix this? I can't exactly fix this with this API. What I can do is return a function inside of the function. and do the exact same thing inside there. I'm just going to switch this to a getAdd function, higher order function, I guess, and I'm going to call getAdd in there. And now it still works again. I have my stateful function back, and I cannot touch foo inside internally, right? So those are the requirements that we want. We want stateful functions, and we want them to be protected. We want that state to be protected. The last JavaScript refresher. So this is a closure, right? The add function is this anonymous function in here, and it closes over this foo variable that's inside of the getAdd function. No one else can access it, but add can access it every time it's executed. That's closure. So the last thing I'm going to remind you, and then we'll actually start to clone React, is that if I don't want this ugly getAdd thing, it's kind of ugly, I can just delete this, replace getAdd with a parenthesis, and I'll just paste it in there, and it does exactly the same thing. So this is the module pattern. It's also called the IIFE, the immediately invoking function expression. A lot of you have seen it if you look at bundler output. All right. Let's clone React. So first thing I want to clone is the useState variable, useState hook. It takes an initial value and init val, I'm going to call it. And what does it return? It returns a state and it sets state. I'm going to refer a lot, by the way, to the docs. Like if people are new to hooks, definitely check out the docs first before watching this talk. So how do you define state and set state? How do you implement that? We're just going to have some internal variable. Let's just call it internal value, and we're just going to initialize it to init val. We're going to have state, and let's just assign that to val for now. This is wrong, but we'll just get something showing on the screen, and then we'll modify from there. Set state takes a new value, and it sets that new value to the internal val. Okay, good. So now we have hooks in Node. Let's use it. Count, set count. So this is destructuring, array destructuring, and all that. So again, these are all standard JavaScript patterns that are pretty handy when doing this. And then now we're going to console.log count. We're going to set count to 2, and then we're going to console log count again. So what I expect is to log out 1 and 2. Unfortunately, I log out 1 and 1 over here, and that means that it's not really working. Unfortunately, it actually is that set count is working. It's modifying internal value. But the problem is when I destructure, this counts is assigned the value of 1, and it is 1 here, and it is 1 here. That's why we're logging out 1. So we need some place to just re-poll the internal state again. One easy, very cheap way to do it is to turn the state into a getter function, and now I can just call get, and just call the function. And now I have my stateful function back again. So 1 and 2. And this is kind of hooks in Node. If you need hooks in Node, that's all the implementation. It's 8 lines. But we want to do more than that. In React, you don't call a getter function. You just use the variable, and it's live every time, and it's just fresh, and it's the correct value. You don't call it a weird getter function. So we want to model that, but it involves a pretty large refactor. I'm going to walk you through it. You already know everything that you need to know. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit. All right, so the first thing we want to do is put our hook inside of a React module. I'm going to cut this. I'm going to introduce a React module. It's going to be a function that I immediately invoke, right? I'm going to paste my hook in there, and I'm going to return an object that has a useState property. So now the only thing I've changed is in my usage, I can call react.useState, and it does exactly the same thing. Everyone with me, right? Okay, cool. So I created my React module, and I've sort of wrapped up my functionality. I can do that to my hook as well. What wraps around a hook? A component, right? So I can declare a component, and that's just a regular function, and put the hook in there. Normally I'd be rendering to the DOM, but in this case I don't have the DOM, I just have the console, so I'm just gonna return an object and simulate that. We'll get to the other stuff in a second. So render, I'm gonna have console.log count, and then click. This is just for simulating. I don't have a button, so we're just gonna roll with this. It's the best you got. And I'm just gonna put in an object. Forget the object. Okay, so the last thing that we need to do is we need to teach. We have React, and we have the component. We need to teach React how to render the component. So let's write the render function. It takes a component, and a component is just a function, right? So let's just call it. And then when you call it, you get an object that has a render and a click, right? So let's just call the render, right? Let's actually just log something out on the screen. And then we'll just return it so that we can do other stuff with the component. And I'm going to expose that inside of my React module over here. So we're at 16 lines, not too bad. And now I can replace all this logging stuff and do something like react.render component. We should see something show up on the screen. Oh, that's not exactly what I want, but whatever. And I can, because there's a return value over here, I can take this and I can start accessing stuff on the object, right? Like the click function that I wrote. So I can just say click, and I can re-render it again. React.click is not a function. Oh, it's app.click. Okay, cool. It's a little bit like TDD. You get instant feedback in this REPL thing. It's really nice. Okay, so the only thing that's wrong with this now is I'm logging the state getter, right? That's the thing that we did just now. That was like a hacky thing. Let's just get rid of that. Let's lift the value up to the internal value up to the scope of React. And we're going to get rid of the getter function. We don't need it anymore. And we're just going to let the getter function close over the internal value, the useState hook close over the internal value. So now it just returns every single time it renders. So this is the, okay. So this is blah, 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 new value. Okay. I'm running into something that I didn't expect over here, so I'm gonna try to debug a little bit. I think, okay. Set count? Yeah, I think I set count. Oh, yeah, I need to +1, of course. If I'm setting counts to the original counts, it's not gonna increment, so yeah, okay. So I practice this a lot, so it's very unusual for me to scroll like that. So you can see we have our stateful functions back, right? And we've gone through a whole bunch of ceremony, but now we have a React module. We have a component, right? It kind of looks like a component. And we can do things to the component, and it updates in state. So that's really good until you try to have multiple states, multiple hooks. So let's just have a text hook. It's going to look slightly different so that you can differentiate between the number and the text. I'm going to call it Apple just because that's the first thing I think about. I'm going to log it out as well. So we're going to log it out in our render. And I'm going to have a new method. I'm just going to call it type. I'm just going to take a word, and it's going to set text to that word. Okay. Let's get rid of this. And we'll use that type function here. And you'll see what's wrong with it in a second. So I'm going to set that to pair. OK, so what's happening here? Our component is here. It's got 2 hooks. The first click happens, and both count and text are both set to 2. And then we have app.type, and both count and text are both set to pair. So what's wrong with this image? We are trying to use 2 hooks, but they're just using the same store in the memory, right? Because we only have 1 variable, and it's constantly overriding that single variable. So the mental image of hooks that you have now should grow a little bit, and you should think of hooks as arrays of effects. So let's just use an array, and to know which hook we're currently operating on, we also need an index. So I'm going to have an index of 0. So now it's pretty clear. We're going to replace all the internal values with just hooks and the current index. So now nothing has changed because we're still not incrementing the index. So I'm going to have a rule that at the end of a hook, after we're done, we should just always increment the index so that the next hook can take place. So now we have an independently updating count. And text is not changing. That's good. But over here, we still have this weird bug. And that's because I just keep incrementing index +1, +1, +1, +1. I need to reset it back to 0 so that every single time I re-render, it's going to start and go through all these hooks from scratch because it's referring to that internal hook storage. So, yep, let's just set it to 0. And now I'm going to break everything. And this is because of a very subtle bug again. Set state is called asynchronously. Set state is called after render, right? And by that time, the index is actually set back to 0. So this index being a live value, that's a problem for us. The way to fix that problem is to freeze it. So let's have an internal index, and we'll just freeze it. And we'll let set state close over, second usage of closure, close over that internal frozen index value. Okay, so now we have a component. We are rendering it. We have a count of 1. We're clicking. The count updates to 2. the text doesn't change. Then we type pair, and then count doesn't change, and text changes. So we have independently moving states, right? And that's something that's a new paradigm in the hooks model as well, that every component used to have one object for state, and everything, you were just forced to put all your state onto that object. Now you have independently moving states, and you can be a bit more precise with that. All right, so, and you can already start to see some of the issues with some of the rules of hooks. So these are, when people introduce hooks, I think one of the biggest problems with hooks that people had was that you have to call them unconditionally. You couldn't put them inside an if or a loop or some sort of dynamic value. So I just want you to imagine what happens to this if I do like math.random more than 5.5, right? So this gets called half of the time. What is the hook index value of this? This should be 1, the hook index value, but sometimes it's 0 because this doesn't execute. And so the state values get off, right? So you're just not allowed to do that, and that's why we have linters. And that's why you understand the rules of hooks just on a fundamental basis. Okay, so we're not done. I'm not happy. We only have the state hook. We also have the effect hook. The best way to model this is to just use it, and then we'll backfill what that is. So a use effect hook takes a callback. We'll just say console.log JSConf. And then it also takes an optional dependency array. I'm just going to use an empty array for now. All right, so we have that API. Let's go and implement it, right? So this is our module again. So function, use effect, callback, and dependency array. Okay, so this is the hardest part of the talk. Bear with me, but I know what I'm doing, so we're good. So we want to have this variable. We'll just have like whether it has changed or not. We'll just set it to true. So by default, we're just going to keep re-rendering. And if the dependencies have changed, we're going to call the callback, right? That makes sense? If the dependencies have changed, we're going to call the callback. So the hard part is to detect change over here. In order to detect change, we need to basically diff the old dependencies and the new dependencies. That means we need to store and keep around the dependencies somewhere. Where's a good place for that? Turns out it's the hooks array. So we're going to store it inside of the hooks array, and we'll draw it out at the start of our effect, the old dependencies, so hooks index. Okay, sometimes this is undefined though, so that's why we need to guard it with an if. Oh, and by the way, always increment the index at the end of the hook. Okay, so sometimes this is undefined, so what we're going to do is replace this and just go, if the old dependencies do exist, that means we have an old array and a new array. This is the hardest part in the entire code, so bear with me. So we're going to modify hash change to look at dependency array. We want to look at some of them. We want to do array.sum. That's just a lesser known array prototype method. We want to look at the dependency and that index, and we want to compare that dependency to that index. We're going to use object.is. So a lot of people, I don't know this. React uses object.is internally because not a number, triple equals not a number is false. Object.is, not a number, and not a number is true. So that's just a slightly better option, so people went with that. So we're just going to say object.is dependency and the old dependencies, the corresponding index of that old dependency. I think that's it. Oh, and then we need to expose it in our React module. Ba-boom. So what do we have now? We have a component with a use effect of an empty array. It only runs once at the start and never again in any of the updates. If I put in count here, then it depends on that count, and it updates when the count changes from 1 to 2, it runs. If I change it to text, when the text updates from apple to pear, it runs. And when I delete it, it also runs every single time. So that's the spec of the use effect, and it wasn't that hard, right, to implement all this. So this is normally where, this is as far as I planned to go. I was like, okay, you've kind of proved out the hooks model. But I'm a very ambitious person, and I was like, this kind of looks like React, but it's not really React. Everyone kind of knows that. So what can I do to put this on the DOM? Which is a really stupid question to ask for a live coding talk. But we're going to do it. This looks like Node, but actually we have not been coding in Node at all. It's just been the console. And I have a browser implementation here thanks to Code Sandbox. So let's do it. Actually, that was probably a bad idea. I have some pre-prepared CSS. I'm going to import that. it's not showing the autofill. Animated background. Very nice CSS effect for demos. And then I also have some utilities that I imported. So I have a create element object that I have from my utils folder. And what create element does is what JSX compiles to by Babel, right? Hopefully everyone knows that. I'm going to expose it inside of my React module, and now I can use JSX inside of my component. So I'm going to say div hello world. Let's get something to show up on the screen. Unfortunately, we're not done. Sorry, let me just comment that out. Unfortunately, we're not done. We also need a render function that actually renders to a DOM element. So let's just import render. Okay, the render API that I have written is slightly different because it memoizes the hooks. So I'm just going to delete the render function that we wrote, and I'm going to expose the render function. It's a higher order function. It just takes the hooks, and it outputs a render function that we can actually use like you would use a normal render function. So let's just go like that. Hey, very nice. So we have JSX. This is JSX. And it only works because of React.createElement and the Babel JSX plugin. OK, let's keep going. So what do we do? Let's actually prove out that everything works. And this is a full React clone. It's not, but trust me. So let's have a button. I took the opportunity to, all right, anyway, you'll see what happens. I'm going to write a standard event handler. It's going to set counts to count +1. That was the first time I ever forgot the +1, and obviously it's on stage. Very stressful. And it just says, click me, for example, and then it's going to have the current count. Yeah, everyone should be very familiar with this. I don't have hot reloading figured out, so you're going to see me manually refresh a few times. So yeah, button showed up. I have some nice CSS because I cheated. But if I click it, it doesn't work. Why? Because remember when we were doing this, we were manually re-rendering every time, right? React has this concept of a work loop. It always loops around to check if there's work to be done. So we need to simulate this work loop by manually doing it. And I was like, screw it, I can write a work loop. That's not too hard, right? It's only, we've got like 10 minutes. So let's write a work loop. And the work loop is simply, I'm going to set the index to 0, because every time you render, you have to set the index to 0. We're going to call the render function, again, pass in the hooks argument. And then we're going to call the set timeout with the work loop. I'm going to set a loop of 300 milliseconds. In reality, it's request idle callback, so it's much faster, but this is what you get. This is what works for this demo. So we have clicking. We just live coded this. The last point I want to make, I think, in this entire thing is I have custom hooks. Notice that we did not write any custom hooks code, right? Nothing here was specific to custom hooks. But if I paste this pre-prepared custom hook, let's see where the custom hook. I have a useDogs hook. It has a state. Which has an array. It fetches an API based on the count that I feed in. Count is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it gives back a number of pictures, a number of URLs of dog images, and it just returns that image. So I can use this custom hook. Again, I didn't do any custom hook specific code, right? I can use dogs. It wants a count, so I pass in the count from there. And I can render that into map, item, bog standard stuff. Completely not accessible, by the way, but I'm the only one accessing this code anyway, so it works fine. You should have an alt tag. So let me, all right. Again, I haven't figured out hot reloading, but this is a fully working app. So thank you. So then I'm like, okay, so the punchline, what is the punchline? This is the punchline. I'm just going to paste it in, and I'm going to remind you of what we're talking about. This is not React. This is not React. I have a fully dynamic app. I have the full API. I have JSX. I have custom hooks. I have the render. I've cloned everything that you usually use. This is not React. Why? I cloned this in 40 lines of code, If you minify it, it fits in a tweet. If you're wondering about the utils folder, by the way, the utils folder is only 120 lines, and it's mostly helper functions like create text element and all that JSX needs. So this is not React. What is React? So that's where I'm going to leave you. I have homework for you. I want you to go home and write React from scratch. I want you to practice. I want you to practice closures. I want you to get good at understanding the mental model and understand what you use React for. You don't use React for this API. API is really good, right? And we can copy it. Vue will copy it, like Svelte will copy it. But what do you use React for? What is the hundreds of the thousands of lines of code? What is that for? I have my answer. I'm going to tweet all this out later. But I want you to have that curiosity. Don't just stop at the surface. And that's my talk. You can see the full source at swyx.io/talks. Thank you.